Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are focusing on a military unit that is, well, almost synonymous with daring, skill, and just sheer grit. Wellington's Riflemen, specifically the 1st Battalion of the 95th Rifles.
These are the famed Green Jackets.
Yeah.
And they really do stand in this sort of pantheon of military legend. You hear them mentioned in the same breath as Cromwell's Ironsides or, I don't know, maybe the paratroopers at Arnhem.
Right. They represent this pinnacle of early modern British professionalism. And I think for many of you listening, your image of them is probably filtered through decades of, let's be honest, heroic narrative.
Oh, absolutely. And perhaps most vividly through popular historical fiction.
Yeah.
I mean, the Sharp series is inescapable.
And that legendary status is precisely what we're here to probe. Our mission today is a deep dive guided really entirely by the primary sources, the diaries, the letters, the official records.
We're trying to strip away that romantic embroidery and give you the unvarnished truth of this one battalion's 6-year odyssey. It's an incredible story. From their embarkation in 1809 right up to their final, very difficult performance at Waterloo in 1815.
We want to focus on the reality of the soldier's life.
Yes.
The suffering, the plunder, the tactical genius, and, the disciplinary crises.
Exactly, because the internal records show that alongside the extraordinary heroism, you find things later historians, well, they tended to screen them out. You see documented instances of everything from cowardice, theft, or bungling.
So we want to see how these men, through 6 brutal years of campaigning, actually established a core identity of the Light Division. It's a complete and at times a pretty harrowing picture of what it took to be a fighting man back then.
And in doing so, you really defined what it meant to be a modern British soldier, a soldier trained for precision, not just, massed volleys.
Okay, let's unpack this. We should start with their identity right at the beginning.
Right. May 1809, the 1st Battalion is marching to Dover. And you can feel, even in the records, this palpable sense of anticipation.
They were a unique corps, and not just because of the green uniform. That was a clear break from the red of the rest of the army, but it was more than that.
It was. They were a corps being rewarded for actual effectiveness. I mean, they had just been allowed to form a 3rd Battalion, which sent this powerful signal throughout the military establishment. There was a genuine, buzz of excitement about this new form of warfare that the 95th represented.
And all of that excitement, all of that buzz was founded on one single piece of technology which truly revolutionized their role.
The Baker rifle.
The Baker rifle. It was the linchpin of their entire tactical philosophy. It's what set them so far apart from the redcoats carrying the standard, wildly inaccurate smoothbore musket.
Absolutely. And the decision to adopt the Baker was a deliberate, almost a data-driven choice. It wasn't just pulled off a shelf. The Board of Ordnance mandated competitive trials.
So they were, A/B testing rifles back in the early 1800s?
In a way, yes. They needed a weapon that was accurate, that was robust, and was functional in the field. And the records from those trials, they confirmed the Baker's superiority. It showed reliable accuracy at 100 yards. It was tough enough to survive service. And critically, the bore was designed to minimize fouling.
Which means you can fire more shots before the barrel gets choked up with powder residue and becomes useless.
Precisely. You can keep fighting effectively for longer.
And this is where the technical detail gets really interesting because it defines their tactics. The sights. Most muskets of the era were, they were essentially point-and-shoot instruments.
Right. A single foresight if you were lucky. The Baker was practical and superior because it featured sights along the entire length of the barrel. So you have a foresight near the muzzle and, crucially, a back sight near the lock.
Which lets you align the 2 points precisely with the target. It's intuitive to us now, but revolutionary then.
And more than that, the back sight could be adjusted. Riflemen were taught to compensate for long-range shots. They understood the ball would droop over, say, 300 yards, and they have a physical mechanism to correct their aim for that.
So they weren't just volume firing, they were solving ballistic problems in the middle of a battle.
Which meant their training had to be completely different from line infantry. This was systematic marksmanship training, something unheard of for the rank and file at the time.
What did that involve?
Well, they practiced firing from various positions, standing, kneeling, and prone, using natural cover, presenting a smaller target to the enemy. But they also trained in techniques for shooting at running targets.
So learning how much to lead a target.
Exactly. Compensating for the milliseconds between pulling the trigger and the ball actually striking. That's what made them such lethal skirmishers.
Now, you have to contrast that with the infantry they were up against, the French system, their muskets, the fusils. They only had a foresight.
Right. They lacked that ability to truly align a shot, and their doctrine reflected that deficiency. The prevailing calculation for a smooth-bore musket, even a well-maintained one, was that maybe one shot out of every 200 fired in the field actually hit anything.
1 in 200, that's staggering.
So French conscripts got virtually no marksmanship training. The expectation was simple. You fire in mass volleys to create shock and smoke, and then you charge with a bayonet.
And the French military establishment had a kind of ideological aversion to the rifle, didn't they?
A deep one. They saw it as a weapon for, and I'm quoting here, phlegmatic, patient assassins,
Yeah.
like German Jaegers or American frontiersmen. They felt it was entirely unsuitable for the supposedly passionate French soldier who preferred the decisive, glorious bayonet charge.
So you have this elite corps, technologically superior, uniquely trained, ready to embark. But who were the men actually marching to Dover in May 1809? It wasn't some uniformly professional force.
Oh, not at all. It was all a mix of experience and, frankly, raw desperation. If you look at the nearly 50 officers, many of them were what you'd call soldiers of fortune.
Meaning they were trying to advance on merit, not by purchasing their way up the ladder.
Exactly. The vast majority had never bought a commission. Their rank was earned through service, and it was often tied to some pretty harsh personal circumstances that made this a craving for advancement their primary motivation.
And in the ranks, you've got the hardened veterans, the old riflemen, mixed in with the true novices, the Johnny Raws.
We have the perfect example in the account of Private Robert Fairfoot.
Tell us about him.
Well, Fairfoot is a great case study of how the ranks were filled. He was a physically capable man, tall, well-made, but he'd been in the 95th for less than 4 weeks. A veteran commented scornfully that he had scarcely learned the rifle drill.
And his backstory was complicated.
To put it mildly, he'd volunteered out of the militia, but his past was dark. He deserted 3 separate times from his previous regiment, the Royal Surreys, and he was always caught.
So volunteering into the Rifles, a regiment bound for foreign service, was his last chance.
His desperate last chance to become a proper soldier. He knew that desertion on active service was a guaranteed capital offense. For a lot of these men, the Army was a refuge from something worse.
And the journey began with an immediate, painful taste of the brutality of service, right? Centered around the issue of women.
Yes. On previous campaigns, wives who followed the Army had faced horrendous fates, dying of exhaustion or worse, being violated and murdered by enemy cavalry. So this time, the commanding officer issued an ironclad, strict command. No women were accompanying the expedition.
A decision that led to this intensely emotional and chaotic scene at the dockside.
The sources describe the wailing and oaths of women just clinging to their husbands. They saw that the moment of final leave-taking had arrived. Officers had much ado to part them, literally having to physically separate families.
And then this strange moment of defiance.
A paradox, isn't it? After all the tears, the wives on the quay gave 3 cheers for the 95th. One officer noted the irony, saying their cries were all the more poignant for knowing well that numbers must never return to their native land.
And then the men had to confront the sheer physical reality of what they were sailing towards, the weight of their kit.
It was staggering. They clambered onto the boats carrying a truly unbelievable amount of equipment. The weight of their fighting kit could easily reach up to 80 pounds.
80 pounds. That's the rifle, ammunition, heavy wool uniform, haversack, blanket.
And all their personal items. They weren't just soldiers. They were human pack animals, embarking on a campaign that would test the very limits of human endurance.
Once they were ashore and began marching through Portugal, the reality of military command immediately hit them. And it was embodied by the leader of the Light Brigade, Brigadier General Crawford.
Black Bob. Robert Crawford was a fascinating paradox. He had this genuine intellectual grasp of military theory. It's a quality that Sir Arthur Wellesley Wellington deeply respected. It's why Crawford was entrusted with the dangerous outposts.
But that intellect was balanced by an explosive temperament and this desperate need for redemption.
Precisely. Redemption stemming from a previous, deeply embarrassing failure. Crawford carried the severe ignominy of having surrendered British forces at Buenos Aires years earlier.
So his current obsession with zeal was his path back.
It was his calculated path to resurrecting his reputation. He enforced a discipline that was so extreme, so calculated, that he sought to excite the admiration of Sir Arthur Wellesley. And that zeal, unfortunately for the men, translated very quickly into outright tyranny.
One of your sources, Captain Leach of the 95th, described Crawford's standing orders as the most tyrannical and oppressive that were ever compiled by a British officer. These weren't just strict, they were obsessively pedantic.
They governed everything. I mean, everything. From the minute details of camp hygiene to the exact time of reveille. The daily marches were regulated with the precision of a Swiss timepiece, all orchestrated by 4 distinct horn blasts.
The baggage had to be loaded 10 minutes before the second blast.
Right. But the truly infuriating part for the men was the micromanagement of human movement.
That order about not stepping aside to avoid water, it just stands out as particularly absurd. Confinement for avoiding a puddle.
It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But Crawford had this mathematically precise justification for it. He enforced Article 3, Number 4, which stated that any man who, for the sake of avoiding water, presumes to step on one side or quit his proper place in the ranks must be confined.
And his reasoning was?
He believed that even a smallest deviation by one man, when amplified across an entire marching column, ruined his time-distance calculation. He argued that the momentary delay caused by one regiment defiling could delay a whole brigade by half an hour over the course of a day. He saw that as a tactical catastrophe. He was trying to regulate their every muscle twitch.
And he particularly despised the 95th, didn't he? Their unique approach, their status as an elite, autonomous corps.
He saw their greencoats and their skirmishing freedom as signs of indiscipline. So Crawford felt he had to enforce fear to bring them into line. Veterans recalled him during the Corunna campaign, physically assaulting a man and shouting that infamous line.
You think because you're a rifleman, you may do whatever you think proper.
But I'll teach you the difference before I have it done with you. His goal was submission, plain and simple, not motivation.
Which brings us to the crucial counterpoint within the 95th itself. Lieutenant Colonel Sidney Beckwith. He was the regimental commander, the idol of the Green Jackets, who represented a philosophy almost diametrically opposed to Crawford's.
Beckwith was a genuine intellectual leader. He was known for his extraordinary self-control, which stood in such stark contrast to Crawford's frequent apoplectic rages. And Beckwith had this fundamental belief that soldiers performed best when motivated by encouragement or by shaming them in the eyes of their peers.
Not through the coercion of the lash, which was the staple of the British Army.
Exactly. He ran the regiment on a principle of trust and earned respect.
And the clash between these two philosophies came to a head when Crawford tried to co-opt the 95th into a system of brute force.
He did. Crawford ordered a junior officer, Simmons, to act as his provost marshal. He was to take drummers from each regiment and flog any stragglers caught lagging behind.
And Simmons was not happy about this.
He was highly indignant at being forced into this brutal role, so he marched straight to Beckwith for advice. And you have to understand, the stakes here were incredibly high. Refusing a direct order from a brigadier general was an act of profound insubordination.
So how did Beckwith, the regimental idol, handle that political hot potato?
Instead of forcing Simmons to obey, Beckwith went and verbally admonished the confined men himself, maintaining his moral stance against flogging. Then he told Simmons to just return to his company, and with this quiet dignity, he said that he would answer to Crawford personally.
Wow, he took the heat himself.
He did. And that act of protecting his men and defying an oppressive superior, that's what cemented his status as the idol of the regiment. It was a calculated risk that ultimately paid off, because his men repaid that loyalty tenfold in battle.
And Beckwith's philosophy also led to some ingenious, practical discipline, like how the 95th prevented straggling and plundering, which were massive problems for the rest of the army.
It was peer pressure enforced by logistics. It was brilliant, really.
Yeah.
If a rifleman needed to fall out of the line of march, maybe to relieve himself or fix his kit, he was required to hand his weapon and his haversack over to his comrades.
Ah, so if he loitered...
Not only was he unarmed, meaning he lacked the instrument for threatening the locals, but he earned the intense, visceral displeasure of his messmates, who were now doubly burdened with his arms and pack.
And the anger of your mates is a far more effective deterrent than the remote threat of a whip from some officer.
Far more. It was genius.
It sounds like Beckwith really understood the need to balance severity with allowing the men some freedom.
He was a realist about human nature. During marches near the River Kaya, instead of vexing them with Crawford's petty regulations, he encouraged small indulgences. He ordered the men to march in light gear foraging caps and a stick, not their full cumbersome kit.
And the sticks weren't just for walking.
The sticks were for beating the grasslands. It allowed them to hunt duck, snipe, and bustards. This provided sport enjoyment, and critically, it put supplemental food in the pot. It ensured his officers and men would follow him cheerfully through fire and water.
Yet, even with Beckwith's humane philosophy, the regiment was not immune to the volatility of military life. The case of Tom Plunkett is a perfect illustration of how quickly an exemplary soldier could fall.
Plunkett was a legend within the 95th, an absolute legend. He was the acclaimed crack shot, celebrated for having potted a French general in a previous action. Beckwith had even publicly singled him out as a pattern for the battalion.
But after a new promotion to sergeant,
He got blind drunk at Camp Omer. When his comrades tried to restrain him, he became violent, retrieved his rifle, barricaded himself in a hut, and swore to shoot the first person sent to arrest him.
that is open mutiny, punishable by death. How could Beckwith deal with a man who was both a hero and a dangerous, drunken mutineer?
It was an immediate crisis. Plunkett had committed what Beckwith himself called a blackguard's crime. So Beckwith and his officers, they made the decision to settle the matter internally with a rapid regimental court-martial.
You keep it quiet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were acutely sensitive about the 95th's reputation. They did not want mutinous behavior, especially involving one of their most famous marksmen, publicized in Wellington's general orders, which would have happened if it went to a general court-martial.
So Plunkett was stripped of his stripes and sentenced to 300 lashes. But Beckwith intervened. He didn't let the full punishment go ahead.
No. The entire battalion was paraded, ensuring the maximum possible humiliation. Ned Costello, who idolized Plunkett, watched as the buglers administered the lash. Beckwith had to shout at the bugler to strike harder to make sure the severity was understood. But after only 35 strokes, a tiny fraction of the sentence, the colonel ordered the flogging stopped.
And he used that moment for a powerful public demonstration.
He did. He addressed the bloodied prisoner loudly enough for every man present to hear, and he delivered that devastating line. "You see now, sir, how very easy it is to commit a blackguard's crime, but how difficult to take his punishment."
A calculated balance. He showed that the regiment values skill but won't tolerate insubordination, and at the same time that mercy was possible, but only under the 95th's roof.
It was a masterclass in leadership.
The regiment's internal struggles were, of course, compounded by the enemy that stalked all armies of the era: disease and just relentless physical degradation. The campaign life was savage.
The first major blow was the Guadiana fever, likely typhus or intermittent fever. Soon after arriving, the disease just swept through the ranks. Simmons, Costello, Fairfoot. They were among the hundreds of men stricken. They were laid out for weeks with intense fevers, sweats, delirium. It put them out of action faster than any French bullet.
And the Army's medical system, designed for quick triage, it just became an extension of the battlefield misery. What were conditions like in the General Hospital in Elvas?
The records paint a horrific picture. The hospital was set up in an old convent and it was entirely inadequate for the thousands of sick men. There was chronic medical neglect. One patient described his legs and feet being like ice, while multiple blisters on his back went untreated and undressed.
Unbelievable.
And Private Costello specifically recorded that he recovered only thanks to my good constitution, but none to the brute of an orderly. A man who, during Costello's fever-induced delirium, beat him most furiously with a broomstick. The sources are crystal clear. Sympathy there was none.
And beyond disease, the sheer physical toll of constant marching in the heat, coupled with a poor diet, was a slow killer.
Men were just dropping dead from heat stroke. Officers noted the transformation in their subordinates. Their clothes began to hang loose on them as the men just wasted away. One officer, with that dark irony common to the rifles, suggested that if any corpulent person despairs of reducing his weight, he should simply try a few weeks' change of air and scene at Almaraz as a kind of drastic weight loss cure.
So we have to ask the question, what was the true motivation driving these men to endure this constant suffering and neglect? It couldn't just be patriotism.
For some, maybe. But for the majority, the motivation was a complex mix of adventure, economic necessity, and the promise of material gain.
You take someone like Ned Costello.
He was seduced by his uncle's romantic campaigning yarns. But for men like Private William Brotherwood, it was simple desperation. He was a stocking weaver who'd been thrown out of work by the fickle dictates of fashion in England. Military service, even at 6 pence a day, was a refuge from starvation.
And that 6 pence a day was augmented by the greatest incentive of all, plunder.
Plunder was a critical survival mechanism and a huge motivator. A French prisoner, especially an officer, would be immediately stripped of valuables coins, a watch, a silver snuff box. This was considered the dark but expected fortunes of war.
And the riflemen justified it.
Well, they justified it bitterly, recalling that the French had no hesitation in robbing any British soldiers who fell behind. This promise of sudden material wealth kept a lot of men focused on the fight.
And for the officers, the motivation was status and upward mobility.
Exactly. Their entire dream of glory was tied directly to rank. Captain Peter O'Hare, the regiment's senior captain, had worked 15 years for his seniority and was thirsting for the step to major. The sources confirmed that many of the officers, these men who hadn't bought their commissions, were desperate men due to their harsh personal and family circumstances. This collective, intense ambition meant that the entire flotilla that sailed in 1809 was just bursting with anticipation.
Now, despite these motivations, the strain inevitably led to evasion and a breakdown of order in the rear of the army. This famously created the crisis of the Belém Rangers.
This was a cynical and widespread problem. Men discharged to the general hospitals would linger in Lisbon, particularly around the barracks at Belém. They enjoyed the cheap wine, and crucially, they were avoiding the return to the front line, to the floggings and grape shot. Crawford estimated hundreds of men were sulking in this manner.
And some of these skulkers were remarkably adept at leveraging the Army's systemic chaos to their advantage.
Private Billy McNabb is the standout example. He was a clever fellow from Falkirk who had the rare skills of being able to read and write. He quickly ingratiated himself with a few overworked surgeons running the military hospitals and secured a coveted position as a ward orderly.
Which gave him an extra 6 pence a day in pay.
And, most importantly, it allowed him to avoid returning to his regiment for nearly a year. Headquarters didn't catch on quickly because the surgeons, desperate for competent help, resisted every attempt by regiments to reclaim their men.
So McNabb was living a comparatively comfortable life until Wellington finally issued a general order to force the issue.
Wellington recognized how severe the problem was and ordered that Portuguese civilians be hired to replace soldiers like McNabb, and that the soldiers are to be sent by the first opportunity to their regiments.
So McNabb gets caught.
He does. When his company commander, Captain Mitchell, finally tracked him down, he cheekily insisted that his services were indispensable to the sick. His protestations were ignored. He was subsequently tied to a bullock cart and, amid the jeers of the soldiers, conveyed back to his regiment. A very humiliating return for a very clever man.
While McNabb was cleverly evading duty, others simply reached their breaking point and chose the most drastic form of escape. What was the fate of Corporal Joseph Almond?
Almond is a tragic figure. He was a veteran Cheshire man in the Army for 17 years. He had been busted back from corporal twice for minor misdemeanors. And in his late 30s, the cumulative effect of the hard marches, the poor diet, the petty duties, it simply became too much.
He wasn't a coward, though.
No, not at all. He had fought in all the previous battles, but he was physically and psychologically worn out. He decided desertion was his only option. But note his methodology. He chose to desert near the French fortress of Ciudad Rodrigo, knowing that if he headed in the right direction, he would quickly find Johnny Francois. He was effectively handing himself over to the enemy to escape his own army.
By 1810, the 95th was fully immersed in the tactical realities of the Peninsular War, and their training was about to be rigorously tested, sometimes tragically.
The first major test, the combat of the Coa, in July 1810, was marred by Crawford's poor judgment.
He miscalculated, didn't he?
Grossly miscalculated Marshal Ney's advancing strength. He kept the light division exposed across the Coa River for far too long, and the result was a disastrous skirmish where Ney's corps attacked with overwhelming force.
And the British suffered severe losses.
They did. And the officers of the 95th were left with this deep, hard anger, mourning that all this blood was shed for no purpose whatsoever. It felt like a defeat caused purely by their own general's obsession.
And this failure went right up the chain of command, didn't it? It confirmed Wellington's worst suspicions about Black Bob.
It did. Word of Crawford's harsh regime and his tactical errors reached horse guards. Wellington privately wrote that while he'd once held a favorable opinion of Crawford's talents, he now believed that Crawford allowed the violence of his passions to overthrow the exercise of his judgment.
And meanwhile, the wounded, men like Simmons and Costello, they began that slow, agonizing journey back to miserable, crude field hospitals.
Often hauled in the back of slow-moving Portuguese ox carts. Just brutal.
The tide turned dramatically, however, just 2 months later at Busaco in September 1810. This battle was a near-perfect demonstration of why the rifles existed.
Busaco was a tactical slaughter for the French. They clung to their doctrine. They marched their attack columns slowly up the steep slope of the ridge in these dense, deep formations. This density just made them absolute sitting ducks for the British line infantry and especially for the concealed riflemen. Ney's Corps alone suffered almost 2,500 casualties.
And yet, the 95th's losses were remarkably low. I think it was 9 killed, 32 wounded, and 0 officers lost. What accounted for that massive disparity?
It was concealment and aimed fire versus massed fire. French skirmishers made a great deal of noise and smoke, but they were largely inaccurate. The riflemen, dispersed and trained in using cover, utilized the superior accuracy of the Baker.
And the most damning evidence of this effectiveness lay in the French casualties.
The loss of officers in French ranks was the telltale symptom of well-aimed fire. In one French regiment alone, there were 21 officer casualties. The rifles were picking off the leaders, demoralizing the entire column from the top down.
But the real tactical masterclass for the Light Division came in April 1811 at Sabugal, led by the beloved Colonel Beckwith.
This was a desperate engagement. Beckwith's right wing of the 95th alongside the 43rd was heavily outnumbered. They were facing maybe 4 French columns at once, and they were driven back toward the Coa River in poor visibility. It was a crisis where the division might have been routed.
Yet Beckwith managed to hold them together through sheer force of leadership and personality.
His actions were inspirational. They were defining. He rallied his retreating men not by shouting, but by calmly walking his horse up and down the line, directing their fire with absolute self-control.
And then he was hit.
Yes, a bullet creased his forehead, drew blood, and his soldiers looked up in panic. He just called out, "I am no worse, follow me," before calmly ordering a fighting withdrawal. That kind of bravery and coolness solidified the men's absolute faith in him.
And the outcome was an overwhelming victory for Wellington's forces.
Emphatic. The British inflicted 5 times as many casualties as they sustained, with the 95th losing just 2 men killed. Again, you look at the officers. Of the 5 French colonels facing the Light Division, 4 were casualties, 2 killed, 2 seriously wounded. That is undeniable evidence of the effectiveness of aimed fire against column formations.
Wellington must have been thrilled.
He was exulting. He wrote that, really, these attacks in columns against our lines are very contemptible.
And Crawford, who was, ironically, on leave at the time, must have been entirely mortified to miss the action and the glory.
Mortified is the understatement of the decade. He wrote to his wife, admitting that while he was glad to have seen her, it would be stupid to pretend that I did not feel any regret. He knew he had missed the division's greatest tactical triumph and the praise that went with it. He was forced to watch Beckwith reap the benefits of the discipline he had fostered.
As the campaign moved into 1812, the focus shifted from open field skirmishing to the grinding, desperate, and often morally corrosive work of sieges, specifically Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz.
Siege warfare was a completely different beast. It demanded constant exposure and bravery. The riflemen were critical here, deployed to conduct highly exposed sniping duty. Their job was to lie on the glacis, the sloping, exposed rampart, often only 30 or 40 feet from the French defenders on the walls.
The danger level was just extreme. What were they doing down there?
Their mission was to methodically pick off French gunners and engineers who were trying to repair the breaches or man the defensive works. Lieutenant George Simmons, who commanded one such party, wrote with his startling enthusiasm, "I was so delighted with the good practice I was making against Johnny that I kept it up from daylight till dark."
That dedication to marksmanship kept the French heads down, but the toll on the exposed riflemen must have been constant.
It was, and when the time came for the final assault, storming the breach was arguably the most dangerous task in all of warfare, the famous forlorn hope. Yet men actively clamored to volunteer for it.
Why? The risk was insane.
The motivation was intoxicating. For officers who survived, it was immediate guaranteed promotion. And for the rank and file, it was the promise of rich plunder. It was a desperate gamble for status and wealth.
And we see our guys volunteering.
We do. Corporal Fairfoot, the triple deserter who'd become a model soldier, volunteered for the Forlorn Hope. Private Costello volunteered for the storming party. Both men knew the prize was not just the respect of their comrades, but specifically the chances of plunder in the town.
The successful bloody storm of Badajoz in April 1812 then led to one of the most horrific nights in the history of the British Army. The town was sacked.
For one intense night, all discipline vanished. The sources describe the troops consuming enough looted alcohol to be steaming, drunk, and completely out of control. The crimes were horrific: mass rape, women violated to the point of insensibility, and the outright murder of Spanish inhabitants who dared refuse to hand over their money or possessions.
Wellington's army just completely lost its moral compass.
It was a demonstration of the psychological breakdown caused by the siege's preceding terror.
But for individual soldiers, the promise of plunder was delivered, confirming the dark contract they had made.
Private Costello's experience epitomizes this moral complexity. Amid the horror, he stripped a French officer of his watch. More importantly, he found a breathtaking sum, perhaps as much as 1,000 pounds in Spanish coin, hidden in a muleteer saddlebags.
And then he had to defend it.
From roving hussars, with his rifle. He and his party eventually found sanctuary with a terrified Spanish doctor and his niece, who rewarded the riflemen with a much-needed supper and punch, simply for protecting them from their own comrades. The sack was this moral tragedy punctuated by individual financial windfalls.
In stark, almost jarring contrast to that chaos, the High Command was simultaneously addressing the crisis of desertion from the previous year, leading to mass military executions.
Wellington was determined to restore order after the widespread desertion crisis of 1811. 10 men were tried and sentenced to be shot, and the psychological impact was maximized. The entire light division was curated to witness the executions.
And each man was shot by a firing party from his own regiment.
Yes, ensuring the lesson would not be lost on their comrades. This was state-sanctioned psychological terror, designed to maintain cohesion.
And then came the tragic second trial of Corporal Joseph Almond.
Almond, the worn-out veteran who had deserted near Ciudad Rodrigo in 1811, was captured and brought back. He had marched for days in manacles and pleaded not guilty, citing the intense suffering and privations he had faced.
And there was some sympathy for him, wasn't there?
A general feeling of commiseration among the officers. There was a sense that the necessary lesson had already been learned from the previous executions. But he was sentenced to death again.
Why couldn't anyone save him?
The timing was cruel. His company commander was a junior lieutenant. The more experienced, hard men like Captain O'Hare lacked the political clout to advocate for him against Wellington's stern mandate. Only someone of Colonel Beckwith's immense moral authority could have saved Almond. But Beckwith was gravely ill in England at the time. Almond was executed. A clear message that the system prioritized order over the fate of worn-out veterans.
Later that year, the entire army faced intense privation again during the long, disastrous retreat from Madrid in late 1812.
The suffering became almost unimaginable. It pushed the men past any reasonable breaking point.
What were the conditions?
Intense, cold, freezing weather. Supplies entirely broke down. Men like Simmons were walking barefoot, their shoes having no bottoms, enduring severe frostbite. And crucially, the essential lubricant for Wellington's army, the daily supply of booze, vanished. That compounded the lack of food and warmth.
This level of hardship broke many men mentally, leading to a profound psychological collapse.
Morale plummeted so far that Costello recounted men actually wished to be shot and exposed themselves in action for that purpose. They saw death in battle as preferable to the endless, cold misery of the retreat. They were actively seeking an end to their suffering.
Yet, amidst all this misery, we find that paradoxical kindness that defines the Rifles' famed camaraderie, occasionally cutting right across the British Army's rigid class system.
It's one of the most poignant anecdotes from the campaign. Lieutenant Lord Charles Spencer, a young, wealthy officer, was shivering and pallid, utterly incapable of coping with the deprivation. And yet, the starving rank-and-file riflemen gave their last biscuits to him.
They saw his suffering and responded with selfless generosity.
As Costello so beautifully summarized it, these are times when lords find that they are men, and men that they are comrades. This intense, shared trauma just burned away the traditional distinctions of rank and status, forging a bond that was essential for survival.
As the Peninsular War pushed into 1813, the French hold on Spain crumbled, leading to the triumphant final campaigns across the Pyrenees and into France itself.
And the 95th started this final phase with a perfect demonstration of light infantry agility at San Milan.
A surprise attack.
A significant surprise attack against unprepared French battalions who did not dream that a British soldier was within a day's march of them. The riflemen came running, dropping down to fire, reload now and then, forcing the French ranks to break and flee before the British bayonets could even connect.
So it was psychological warfare paired with accurate fire.
Exactly. And it resulted in an immediate financial windfall for the men.
How significant was that windfall?
Well, 300 prisoners were taken, along with wagons and baggage animals filled with French supplies and personal effects. The Rifles and the Portuguese cacadores immediately set about plundering the trunks. The animals, horses, and larger valuables were later sold off at auction, providing a welcome and substantial cash injection for troops who had suffered so much.
At Vitoria, the 95th played a limited role in the main fighting, which apparently annoyed them, but they were critical in the French route, which saw the French lose almost everything.
Yes, all but one of their artillery pieces and just vast amounts of plundered treasure. And Vittoria was where the great plunder story of Private Costello occurred, the finding of that immense sum of Spanish coin in the muleteer saddlebags. Many soldiers reaped rewards beyond their wildest dreams.
And the officers benefited too, often by just looking the other way.
Of course. Leach, for instance, received bread, Swiss cheese, and brandy from his grateful soldiers. He confirmed that in exchange for these gifts, the men remained free to roam that night for further plunder.
As the fighting then shifted into defensive positions in the Pyrenees and the Nive, we see this fascinating and ultimately dangerous breakdown of the normal rules of engagement.
This was rooted in exhaustion and the looming possibility of peace. British and French pickets, stationed mere yards from each other, began engaging in a roaring contraband trade,
Exchanging goods.
and incredibly frequently went into each other's picket houses. The bonhomie grew so widespread that Costello cheerfully admitted to actively deceiving his own officers about these unauthorized exchanges.
But this friendly atmosphere came with a severe price tag, leading to a major embarrassment at Bassasserie in 1813.
The relaxed vigilance created a catastrophic vulnerability. The Light Division, because of this bonhomie, was taken completely by surprise by a sudden French attack. The cost was immediate and humiliating. 40 men from the 1st 95th and the 43rd were taken prisoner. Their familiarity with the enemy had led them to lower their guard.
So let's look at the staggering final cost to the battalion. After 6 long years, how many of the original 1,095 soldiers who sailed in 1809 actually returned with the battalion?
Only about 350 men. The figures are heartbreaking. 421 men died in Iberia, and while 2/3 died in battle, a third still succumbed to sickness. Disease was the silent, steady killer.
And desertion.
At least 23 deserted officially. But if you consider the mass writing off of soldiers who disappeared from hospitals and were never found, the number of deserters was likely closer to 30.
It's clear that even the most hardened veterans were pushed beyond their psychological limit by the war's end.
Absolutely. By 1815, when Napoleon returned from Elba, the veterans felt a genuine tiredness and even resentment at having to fight again. The highest rates of desertion occurred between 1813 and 1815, after the war was supposedly won. This shows that a significant proportion of those who had survived the worst had been pushed beyond some personal cracking point.
And even at their final defining battle, Waterloo, the strain showed, it revealed a significant lapse that became an unmentionable subject for the regiment's history.
Despite the 95th's low overall losses, only 21 killed at Waterloo, the victory was not clean for their reputation. Primary sources indicate that a significant proportion of Barnard's battalion, possibly around 100 men, fled the line at the sight of the French cavalry charge.
100 men, that's a massive disciplinary failure.
It is, and it was compounded by the fact that Wellington was likely entirely unaware of the specific incident, so it was immediately suppressed and became an unmentionable subject in the regiment due to their ferocious pride in their fighting reputation.
So, the heroic narrative of the 95th Rifles, the legendary Green Jackets, required a great deal of post-war sanitizing by those who survived to write the history.
The officer memoirs, Kincaid's adventures, Leach's rough sketches, were crucial in establishing that heroic image. But they consistently downplayed or entirely censored the uncomfortable realities.
So they rarely mention the frequent use of the lash, even by revered figures like Beckwith.
Exactly, or they downplayed the large-scale larceny and plunder.
Yeah.
And failures, like the bullying of recruits, were smoothed over into these light, humorous anecdotes.
And Crawford, the man who was universally detested during his command, underwent this curious posthumous transformation into a martyr.
He was lionized in print. Despite the hatred he inspired among the men, he ascended into the pantheon of national heroes. This was partly because he had powerful political connections and gentlemanly ghostwriters who made sure his reputation was extolled in print after his death. It became incredibly difficult for officers like Leach and Kincaid, writing their own sanitized memoirs, to openly criticize a national martyr.
Finally, we have to look at what happened to the specific individuals we've tracked through this brutal campaign. Who found glory and who was forgotten?
Lieutenant Simmons survived 2 serious wounds and, through merit, rose to the commission class. Fairfoot, the triple deserter who risked everything to fight, rose to quartermaster in 1825. They found their reward.
But the most poignant example is Tom Plunkett, the pattern for the battalion crack shot.
Despite Colonel Beckwith's best efforts to secure him a pension, Plunkett succumbed to the endemic alcoholism that plagued so many veterans. He was cited years later, still a young man, reduced to selling matches on the cold, unforgiving streets of London. The system had used up his brilliance and simply discarded him.
The story of the 95th Rifles is ultimately defined by this central tension, isn't it? They were an extraordinarily disciplined, effective, and tactically advanced fighting force, true pioneers of modern infantry combat.
But that success was bought at an extraordinary and often invisible human cost. Their effectiveness was fueled not just by honor, but by raw hunger, ruthless ambition, and a fierce, often dark camaraderie that had to endure and sometimes defy the rigid violence and classism of the military system they served.
Which raises an important question for you, the learner, as you digest all of this. The 95th Rifles created the image of the fearless, autonomous skirmisher, often romanticized as escaping the red-coated brutality of the era. They were supposed to be the exception.
Yet our deep dive into their own internal records shows that even in this elite corps, every single one of their successful leaders, from the humane Beckwith to the rougher captains, still frequently used the lash to maintain order. They couldn't escape the violence of the system, and many veterans, even proven heroes, broke under the pressure and deserted.
So if even the celebrated Corps, this band of brothers who defied the enemy on every battlefield, could not escape the desperation and institutional violence of their own army, how reliable is any historical account of honor and glory written by those who survived to tell the tale, and who desperately needed to believe their suffering had a noble cause?
Something to think about. We look forward to your next deep dive.